Ernst, do you have a set of questions?
Yeah, I have a question for you, but I will, let's wait.
Wait for people, okay.
Okay, I think now people are starting to join in.
Okay.
So, but let's wait a minute or two, because the video stops and then people have to switch to the Zoom system and to go into the system. So it takes a while. And
Yeah.
I can see people are dropping in.
Yeah, I see a couple of screens up there already. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. No, we will not see the screens of the people who are dropping in, but I see people are coming in.
We won't see their pictures.
No, we will not. We only
just
see.
get the questions if
Yeah.
there are any. Yeah.
Okay, and I will take care of the questions, and I will say that now because now we are on. So I would like to welcome everybody to this discussion round together with Langdon. We have around 25 minutes time, 20 minutes, 25 minutes. And if you have questions, use this question and answer thing down at the Zoom screen, and just write your questions into that. And then I will take the questions and I will collect them and I will ask Langdon. And just come with your questions. I can see more and more people are dropping in to this conversation. Some people put the questions into the chat. Don't do that. Don't put it in the chat. Do it in the Q&A section of the Zoom system.
Can you read it? Can you read what they've asked?
Yes, I can read that. You shouldn't care about that. I will read it and I will tell you.
I don't care where they put it, just as long as I get it.
I can see it. So I can see it, and questions are already dropping in. However, I would like to start with a question, Langdon.
Okay.
So first, thank you very much for your talk. I really appreciated your talk. And I think it gives a very important dimension to the conversations here at a psychology conference. You know, you bring a political dimension into our thoughts about COVID-19. You talk about the COVID-19 and other emergencies historically, and how they relate to politics. So to principles, how we organize our society and our everyday life. So, and how I understand you, there is a certain tension. So often these emergencies, this generation changing events, they don't really fit to the political principles, how we organize our society and our everyday life. So there are some gaps. So, and now you finish your talk, I think that you say maybe this COVID-19, you're saying even climate change, climate crash didn't really result in the adequate political principles, how we rearrange our society. But now you say COVID-19 might give us the possibilities to rethink our political principles. Okay, and here I have actually 3 questions. Maybe these are too much, but at least I will tell them. And you just
okay, good.
my first question is: where do you see starting points that COVID-19 gives us new political principles to rearrange our society, also connected to climate crash? That's what we need, you are saying, where I and many of us totally agree. So where do you see lines that there's hope? Because in your beginning of your talk, you say the epistemical Luddite project with the students, it didn't work. So, okay, so you have some hopes. That's my first question.
Okay, you want me to answer that one first, or go ahead?
Okay, maybe I tell you all the 3, or should I just take this one?
Well, let me take the first one, because I can give a pretty
good.
You know, we've had a great emergency brewing for almost 40, 50 years, which is climate change, climate crash. And you've had the scientists produce their evidence,
Yeah.
and the political leaders of the world and the people of the world have been thinking about this. But in many ways, it's a kind of emergency that comes at you slowly. And it's also, in some ways, it has been very abstract. Data on warming, data on carbon emissions, and so forth. And then there are predictions about rising seas, rising temperatures, monster storms, and so forth. And I think the one way in which the COVID pandemic is more forceful in making an impression is that it has affected around the world just about everybody's life, right? So you have to come to terms with the way society is organized, how your role fits into employment, income, healthcare, and so forth. So in many ways, I think that unlike the climate crisis, the pandemic is much more immediately revealing, right? So, for example, when the virus broke out, what I did was I immediately got on my private jet and I flew to an island that I own in the Caribbean and decided to live out this experience in my mansion there, right? Of course, I didn't do that, but there are an awful lot of people in today's America, the wealthy few in our society, and that's how they greet the COVID emergency. They have places to go, places to hide, they have their own transportation and so forth. So one of the things that's become increasingly obvious, especially for the poor and minority groups in society, is they are disproportionately injured or even killed in this process, while the political economy of neoliberalism leaves the wealthy and well-to-do pretty much safe and secure. And I think that's also true of climate, but it doesn't appear with such a vivid impact.
Okay, Langdon, there are more and more questions coming in, and I go now to the questions which are coming in, and I have some questions in mind, and maybe I come with them, or maybe sometime later. Babette Babich, a colleague from the US, is asking, what is the difference between the Green New Deal and the Old Deal? Is industry not part of the problem? To contextualize the issue in this way is hugely important, but the promise of the right crisis, as it were, may be seductive given the challenges of the current crisis per se.
Yeah, well, in many ways, I think that the current crisis brings the what's called by some people the Screen New Deal, which is the world we're talking to each other on, and the Green New Deal, which is a kind of climate-oriented environmental reform in society. It sort of brings these two together, right? And if you look, for example, at the lives of students, for example, their world will never, I think, never be the same unless somehow the college campuses reform and get moving their education in that kind of familiar way. So there's a kind of crisis that confronts people in the Screen New Deal, as we're now talking to each other on the screen as a result of the virus, which I think would cause people to say, well, how many of the old patterns will I participate in? In the US, for example, it's a very big question whether undergraduate college and university education can continue, precisely because students and their families, who have to usually borrow lots of money to come to a campus? Will they spend the same money to do this kind of screen New Deal, right? And I think the answer to that, well, we don't know, but I think it's unlikely that college education will have the same form. I think it's also true of workplaces, of buying and shopping, you know, what's generally called the economy. I think in many ways that's all up for contestation.
Yeah. Thanks, Langdon. I just read the questions. So the next question. There's Sana Lettinen, and she's thanking you for your talk, and she's writing, regarding the first part of your talk, would you agree that connecting over the internet via social media, distance work, and so on, makes the COVID-19 pandemic more of a shared event, not as private as previous pandemics? The morbid distancing part this time is that we do not see the death, not even of family members.
Do not see the death?
The dead people.
Yeah. Well, that's a major a part of this experience. We, you know, we're going to about, in the USA, about 100,000 deaths, right? And given the character of the virus, most of the time, the families have not been able to say goodbye, to experience that kind of direct suffering. So there's a huge chasm, emotional chasm that opens up. And yet here we have the screen experience, and I think she's right about this in saying that, well, it is possible now to connect, at least in ways where people are socially distant, you can see and talk with each other. So that contrast that difference, I think, is very much a part of the experience that we're going through.
Yeah. Okay, I have a next question, which actually refers to the question I also had. And it reads, it's from Akadaka Kosei.
Yeah.
The immediate impact. Can you understand me? Can you hear me, Langdon?
Yep.
The immediate impact of the pandemic may be the positive outcomes for the environment of reductions in emission and so on. But how does the systemic change that is necessary to sustain this happen when there hasn't been a change in the narrative around climate change, especially in the US? I think that's a good question about politics. How can we facilitate the politics we need in the future? So, and how, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's a very complicated question. I would simply say the examples that I gave had to do with decline in automobile mileage and airline mileage. It's also true we've seen an immediate drop in carbon emissions and at a level required by the Paris Accords, right? So this is, I think, an opportunity for people to say, oh, we can now see the parts of our economy, the parts of our society, which are highly problematic. And even more than that, it's possible to have very rapid and perhaps even positive change, right? So we've seen the collapse or the decline of carbon emissions in a fruitful way. And now the question arises, well, when the emergency somehow passes, will we simply rebuild the number of airline flights, the number of automobiles on the road, the same ways that we heat our homes and buildings and so forth? So I think there's a great opportunity. First of all, the things are visible. And the other things is that in a short period of time, we've had very rapid change. And that says, well, doesn't that reveal lots of fruitful possibilities?
Hmm. Yeah, thanks. Okay, I jumped just to the next question.
Very
Sometimes
good.
they don't.
I'll try to keep my answers brief.
Yeah, no, that's fine. You're okay. Gaudis is her or his name. Maybe I shouldn't say the name. You mentioned that among many things, even the COVID-19 has steered division in the country in terms of social and moral views. Can you please elaborate more on what you discussed with the way in which the virus has been using militarized language, pandemic versus war? How can we find a balance or find that bridge and bridge less fear in society by such militarized language that is connected to health?
Yeah. Well, my point about the militarized language is that in a society in which there's very little of a sense of a positive common good, the way that Americans have connected and come together over the decades really has been around war, right? So we have a huge investment in the military, and the way that we see how we are connected to each other in common bonds as Americans, very often that is defined by who has attacked us and how we're going to come together to fight, right? And the point that I wanted to make there is that that's a very unproductive. I'd say I described it as preparing for the wrong emergency. In America, I think the wrong emergency is endless preparation for war. And a positive preparation would be to look at dimensions of the common good, better schools, universal health care for all people, repairing our roads and bridges that people depend upon. And my hope is that perhaps out of this crisis, that people will look at those dimensions of the things we hold in common, how we're all made better by certain kinds of policies and programs. And I noted in my talk how when Trump starts talking about COVID, it's an invisible enemy, and he defines doctors and nurses and people that are offering help as warriors against this enemy. So I think that way of framing the question has to be questioned, resisted, and that we look at, let's say, healthcare. Shouldn't we all have government-supported healthcare in America? And it turns out we have tens and tens of millions of people now who have no health insurance at all. The brief reason is they used to get their health insurance from their employer, but we now have about 40 million people who are no longer employed. And that means they don't even have health care.
Yeah. I want to continue here with the question. I think this relationship between pandemic and war, Luca Taddeo this morning in a talk also talked about this, actually in a similar way like you. And he said how catastrophic this is and how different political processes go to talk about the virus as a war against the virus and to disconnect it actually from us and so on. So okay, so the question is how to develop alternative kinds of politics which relate to a climate clash and to have alternative politics, not war politics.
Yeah.
Okay, here I have, my question is, what could be good principles, good political principles we work with? you already mentioned quite a few, but what would you say would be one of the most important ones, where you would say that's a very important political principle, how we can restructure our society or have to restructure our society in the future?
Yeah. Well, I think, I'll just say it in a different way than a point I've already made. I would say, what do we in this society, or even as members of the world community, have in common? What is the shared good that we ought to uphold and strive for, basically? I might say, as I was preparing the talk, I did lots of reading and so forth. And one of the best books that I read was by Frank Snowden. It's called Epidemics and Society. And he makes a very strong point, one of his main themes, and I will just read it briefly. He says, epidemic diseases are not random events that afflict societies capriciously and without warning. On the contrary, every society produces its own specific vulnerabilities. To study them is to understand that society's structure, its standard of living, its political priorities. Epidemic diseases in that sense have always been signifiers. And the challenge of medical history is to decipher the meanings embedded in them. And I would say that's the challenge that faces us now, right? That in a way, the virus has torn away the surfaces and revealed these deeper structures, right? In American society, the structures of politics, of economics, of race and racial discrimination. If you look at how the virus has had its worst effects, it has affected the poor, the elderly, and racial and ethnic minorities. So I would say, well, if we wanted to begin opening up the conversation, that would be a good place to begin, and to attend to questions of social justice.
Okay, time is running, and maybe we take two more questions.
Two more.
Yeah, and there's one from Gordana Jovanovic, and she's writing, and it connects to what you just said. Does not the figure of an enemy shape our thinking more generally, not just during wars? Teifel's theory of social group identity is one example in our intellectual world. How to foster different patterns of thinking and engaging with others? What structural conditions are needed?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I would say in two domains that are significant. One is education, and I think this is an opportunity, whether it's online or in person, to have open discussion, open debate about the experiences that we've all had, right? There aren't no one is particularly expert. No one's an expert on this. So we need a broad ranging discussion and debate about what's happened to us. The other thing that I think is quite important also is the way that these themes and ideas are expressed in the media, right? And for the time being, at least in the United States, we have lots of news about, what's going to happen with the progression of the virus and what its implications will be. But you don't see a kind of turning to the other question, which is, well, since these various social structures and patterns are being called into question, what kind of society would we like to have?
Yeah, thank you. And here is a different question, but also interesting. In terms of your largely isolated tragedy that you already mentioned before, related to the pandemic, do you already take through for the morrow what could be initiated to deal with that and drive solidarity? Did you understand the question?
Yes, I've got that. Yeah. Well, and this is one of the cases in which world societies, especially the one I know best, my own society, I think needs to ask, what do these events reveal about what's fundamentally wrong? And I would say basically in the last 40 years, especially, the United States of America has developed a neoliberal economy, which is based on wealth accumulation. More and more of wealth is handled in the hands of the few. Wages and job prospects have not improved since the 1970s, right? And the idea was, well, this global economy made, products available at low cost at places like Walmart and so forth, so that we don't have to worry about the fact that wages have been flat. A lot of jobs have vanished. People don't have health care, do not have health insurance, right? And it seems to me that the emergency that we now face sort of rips away I would say, the myths of neoliberalism and our existing political mode in the United States, which is oligarchy, right? Neoliberalism and oligarchy, that's what we've got. We've now seen some of the worst consequences of that state of affairs. 100,000 people are going to die. 40 million people are without jobs. So you'd say, well, the bell has gone off. Are we just going to try to go back to the normal? Or are we going to look at these deeper, more troubling and maybe promising issues?
Thank you very much, Langdon. We are already at the end of the session. It was a wonderful talk, and I thank you very much for all your thoughts. I think this enriches our conference and our thinking about these issues in a very, very important way. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ernst, for inviting me. I've enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks.